Thank you so much. Thanks everybody for coming tonight. Very excited to have this distinguished panel here and to see all of you for this important topic. Last week, Quinnipiac Polling Institute released an interesting survey. They asked New Yorkers what they thought of their elected officials, and the lead question was, how do you feel about Mayor de Blasio's performance, approve or disapprove? We learned that 27% of whites approve, 77% of blacks, 66% of Hispanics. We got breakdowns by borough, by age. A similar poll in the Siena survey asked people the same question and broke it down by religion, by income, by political persuasion. But none of those polls from those two very well-respected public opinion surveys told us anything about what Asian New Yorkers feel about their elected officials, despite the fact that Asian New Yorkers make up at least 13% of the population, and that their numbers grew 38% from 2000 to 2010, way faster than any other group. The polling institutes, though, were not alone in ignoring that population. In much of our civic conversation in New York and nationally, Asians are relegated in more ways than one to the category of other. But on our city streets, especially those here in Brooklyn, it's increasingly hard to ignore the fact that there is a real Asian presence in New York. New York City has the largest Chinese ethnic population outside of Asia. Brooklyn is second only to the city itself in terms of the size of its population, and there are now identified 9 Chinatowns in New York City, including 3 here in Brooklyn: Sunset Park, around Avenue U, and in Bensonhurst, which is the area we'll be focusing on for the most part tonight. Simply knowing that the population is there is obviously different from understanding it, and like any group, Asian New York, Chinese New York is not a monolith. The population includes people from different regions, different language backgrounds, and each of the neighborhoods has its own story and a very different present. And so tonight we're going to learn a little bit about that story and where we are now in Chinese New York as it relates to Brooklyn. And to do that, I'm joined by a very distinguished panel. And I'd like to introduce to you Paul Mak, who is the president and CEO of Brooklyn Chinese American Association, a multi-human services and community development organization that services the Asian American population in Brooklyn. Welcome, Mr. Mak. Jie Wen, thank you. Jie Wen Kitman is the executive director of the Greater Chinatown Community Association. She is also a part-time disaster care manager with Catholic Charities Community Services for the Archdiocese of New York, serving victims who were affected by Hurricane Sandy. Welcome, Ms. Kitman. Peter Kwong is a distinguished professor of urban affairs and planning at Hunter College and a professor of sociology at the Graduate Center of the City University of New York. He is a pioneer in Asian American studies, a leading scholar of immigration, and an award-winning journalist and filmmaker. Welcome, Professor Kwong. And we're also very pleased to be joined by Councilman Mark Treyger, who is the Democratic councilman for District 47, which covers Bensonhurst, Coney Island, Gravesend, and Seagate. He is also the co-chair of the Council's Brooklyn delegation and the chairman of the Committee on Recovery and Resiliency. Welcome, Councilman. So, Mr. Kwong, let's start with the big picture. This probably relates to Bensonhurst, other Chinese areas of Brooklyn. But speaking about the community at large, outsiders talking about the Chinese population in New York, what do you feel are the biggest misconceptions, misunderstandings about Chinese New York that you encounter in your work?
Okay, let me just give a little bit broad picture to start out with.
Could you use the mic?
Oh yes, I'm sorry. New York has the largest Chinese population outside of Asia. It's about 570,000. And the growth rate of Chinese in New York City from 2000 to 2010 is 37%. But Brooklyn, New York has even faster. It's 42%. So among all the boroughs, Chinese growth in Brooklyn is the fastest. And Bensonhurst is the largest concentration of Chinese in Brooklyn. And it's about, it increased the last 10 years for over 57%. And it's around 30% of the population in Bensonhurst, let's say. So this is a kind of a perspective. And I want to answer your question by segregating into something. A lot of people talk about Bensonhurst as the second Brooklyn Chinatown. Yeah. So the first one is Sunset Park. Now, this may be the case, and this is where I want to tease out some of the issues about Chinatowns. Normally, when we talk about Chinatown, we talk about it's a place, ethnic group, ethnic Chinese, where they live, where they work, where they shop, where they socialize, right? And in this definition, then, Manhattan Chinatown is. Sunset Park is. Flushing, New York is less so, because Flushing, New York population is more scattered, although the shopping area is more concentrated, right? So when you look at the Bensonhurst, then I wouldn't call it Chinatown, because it's basically a very large concentrated Chinese population living in Bensonhurst, but they are very scattered. And there are residents scattered in many parts of Bensonhurst in a very, very mixed, diverse community. And then you have main drag, thoroughfare. There are very many Chinese shops. So in this sense, then I would say Bensonhurst is basically a place where a lot of Chinese choose to be living as residents, and there are the convenience of certain shopping areas. And furthermore, and this is again, I want to tease out the difference. When you talk about Manhattan Chinatown, when you talk about Sunset Park Chinatown, when you talk about Flushing Chinatown, in general, the residents there are first generation immigrants. But Bensonhurst is something different. A very large number of Chinese moving in Bensonhurst are second or third generation. And sometimes they also have their parents. So in this case, in Bensonhurst, would be many, many Chinese families are three generations living in one location. So as you can see, the composition, the content of Bensonhurst is very, very different from other parts. And another difference is that when you talk about Manhattan, Chinatown, you talk about Cantonese, and now increasing you talk about Fujianese. When you talk about Flushing, we're talking about basic Mandarin speaking. And nowadays, just yesterday, I did there was an NPR program talk about the Northern Chinese. So it's very, very diverse, even among the Chinese ethnic groups. But Bensonhurst is quite concentrated in Cantonese. This is how I would say Chinese community are very different. They all have their unique aspects. And in this case, that, for instance, when you talk about politically, all right, first generation versus people who are second, third generation, their aspiration, their thinking about politics is also different. Okay, I'm just going to leave it at that because that should try to tease out.
Yeah, that sets us up great for the rest of our conversation. Actually, the point you made was one that showed up in some of the statistics I saw. The Furman Center at NYU does this great publication, the State of New York City's Neighborhoods, every year, where they break down detailed stats for each community district. And the district that encompasses Bensonhurst, CB11, in 2010, the last year that they checked, was #1 in the city in terms of population living in racially integrated tracts. In other words, speaking to the dispersion, the professor was talking about 96% of Bensonhurstites, we have a separate panel on that nomenclature, live in racially integrated tracts, which I think was interesting. But Mr. Mak, I'm curious, the differences in the neighborhoods that the professor just talked about, especially in Bensonhurst, in your recollection, in your witness, how did that develop? What's the story behind Bensonhurst developing the way it did compared to Sunset Park or Manhattan Chinatown or anywhere else?
Well, I guess I recall two little things about Bensonhurst. The first thing is that in the early 1980s, I think a lot of old-timers, they were really resisting the newly arrival of the Asian population. So I recall at one point or another, Asian houses were being targeted that Italian or the neighborhood youth actually were throwing eggs to the Asian homes. The second thing is that I was in the Bensonhurst area, and of course we call all over the weekend all those local youth that was driving their cars, playing loud music along 86th Street underneath the subway track, so that is another thing. So talk about the Asian population moving into the Brooklyn area. We have to first look at Manhattan, Chinatown. Over 100 years has been the centralized location, but however, since everyone wants to live in Manhattan, Chinatown, so it created many overcrowding situation. In the 70s or early 80s, in order to get an apartment in Manhattan, Chinatown, you would need to pay $5,000–6,000 for someone to introduce you to an apartment. So for many newly arrival immigrant population, they just couldn't afford it. And then they look at Brooklyn. At first, of course, they look at different areas, including Bensonhurst. So even in the early 80s, we start seeing the Asian population slowly moving into the Bensonhurst area. And then in late 80s or mid 80s, and as more and more Asian moving into the Brooklyn area, they took advantage of the Sunset Park. Many people are looking at Sunset Park having a less number than Bensonhurst as far as the census population is concerned. One of the reasons is because Sunset Park is really, well, many people are calling it Sunset Park Chinatown, but however, we look at that as a Brooklyn Chinatown because the Chinatown consists of a number of different neighborhoods. We have about 60% of the Chinese population reside in Sunset Park, and another maybe 25 in the Borough Park area, and another one in another 15 or 20% in the Bay Ridge area. So when we look at the triangle, actually the number are much greater in number. So while Sunset Park were able to attract a lot of newly arrival immigrant population, but however, they also serve as a stepping stone. So when we see people after moving into Sunset Park for a couple of years, they wanted to move their family into a better neighborhood or more residential neighborhood. So basically, Bensonhurst was the ideal location at the time. So little by little, we start seeing a lot more Asian moving into the Bensonhurst area. So now basically the number are tremendous, both basing by the N line subway station as well as the is that the B line, right? D line, they changed it many years ago. So the numbers are pretty high. But however, when we look at the Chinese population, basically is no more boundary, is no more Sunset Park or no more Diker Heights. Basically, we are seeing the Asian population is really being exploded. So basically, a couple years ago, when we talk about Asian population moving into Diker Heights area, so basically people think that you would be crazy, but however, basically when you walk along Fort Hamilton, basically all the most of the stores are being owned by Chinese. So basically, there's no more boundary. But however, of course, people also want to take advantage of the convenience. So Sunset Park as well as Bensonhurst really offer an opportunity where people can work, can shop, and do many things within their neighborhood. But however, because of the makeup of the neighborhood, so their characters are very different than Sunset Park. So therefore, even though we have seen so many business stores that are being opened by Asian Americans, but however, they are not seeing as much as walking traffic, and the Asian population there, as the professor mentioned, couple generation within a family. So therefore, their priority would be to really save up so that they can benefit their next generation. So therefore,
since we've talked about the history and the demographics, let's bring in Ms. Kitman to talk about the human reality. You work for an agency that serves the human needs of the Chinese community citywide. Do you see any issues that are specific to Bensonhurst that are different from other areas? Is it broadly the same? What do you encounter there in your work?
I think the issue with Bensonhurst is that I think it's the housing price is getting increased, dramatically increasing, because it needs to meet the demand of the populations now. And I have been living in the Bensonhurst since I immigrated with my parents for more than 10 years, and I saw the Asian population growing rapidly over the past few years, and also majority of the Chinese they reside in Bensonhurst because they think that that's a place that they can afford the rent, it's lower crime rate, and also is it's a nice neighborhood that they can live. But it's not really a place that they can really work because they just a place to stay. They will travel to Chinatown, they will travel to different places to work. Yeah.
Councilman, you obviously see this neighborhood in relationship to others that you represent and others you hear about at the council. For you, what, if anything, distinguishes Bensonhurst? What themes there tie into citywide issues? How do you think it stacks up?
Thank you. And this is really a great panel discussion. I thank everyone for being here this evening and for hosting us. I look at this from multiple lenses. My family came here from Ukraine in 1979. I am first generation American. And my family, once they immigrated here to America, they settled in Bensonhurst. I was the first non-Italian on my block. So that's why I made sure when we had the first Asian American family move into my block, I befriended them immediately because I knew the challenges, what it was being the first non-Italian in my block. But I was also grew up, born and raised in the Bensonhurst community. I became an activist in the community. I worked for elected official in the community. I became a teacher at New Utrecht High School, which served predominantly many Bensonhurst, Dyker Heights, Bay Ridge students, Sunset Park as well. And now, as elected official, I have the honor of representing parts of Bensonhurst. My district, I have a good chunk of it, not all of it, and I have Coney Island, Seagate, and Gravesend. But just to kind of give, to harp on some great points made about the historical aspects of our neighborhood of Bensonhurst. And I used to teach history, so forgive me if I go back to that lens. But when you look at when they constructed the R train that connected Manhattan into Brooklyn, when you look at the history, people look at Bensonhurst in the 1920s, many Jewish families, 1950s, Italian families. Well, when they built the R train, many families from the Lower East Side and Little Italy came into our neighborhood. And so, and this I was able to see when you look at a yearbook from New Utrecht High School and flip through the pages of the decades. And you see in the 1920s, 30s, German, Jewish names, 50s, Italian names. Once you go into the 80s, 90s, more Asian Americans, people from the Middle East, Ukrainians, former Soviet Union. So it's fascinating how we have become we were the barometer of the immigration wave. This is the latest chapter in the evolution of Bensonhurst's deep and rich immigrant roots. And there's always push and pull factors for why neighborhoods evolve in certain ways. And I think some points have been made already, but it's worth elaborating. Bensonhurst, you have the D train, you have the N train, you have the F train, you have a number of buses, you have express buses. We're fighting on some more to get more bus service too. Transportation has been a push and pull factor for the evolution of certain neighborhoods. Also, as pointed out, we're a relatively safe neighborhood, public safety. I would also argue that we have one of the finest, if not the finest, school districts in New York City. Thanks in large part as well to the contributions of the Asian American community. So great schools, public safety, transportation, and that of course has an economic impact because then the price of homes skyrocket. And that is a challenge that's very real. And I would actually argue that the rents are not very cheap in Bensonhurst. That I know personally. I'm renting. So it's a great and strong neighborhood. We still have our fair share of challenges and needs, but there are many great anchors built in. Good transportation options, very safe neighborhood. I also just want to mention the evolution of our commercial corridors. Because if you look at, when I grew up, I was born in the early 80s, but I would say the 90s is when I was able to kind of more fully appreciate my neighborhood. In the 90s, when you walk down Bay Parkway in Bensonhurst, you would see a lot of pizzerias. Now, when you walk down, you might see a couple of Asian American bakeries, which are delicious, by the way. Coconut pineapple bun, one of my favorite treats. So it's fascinating to watch the evolution from a child when I was a kid to now. I love it. And so, but again, this is just the latest chapter in the evolution of Bensonhurst's story.
Let's talk about gentrification, the G word as it's known, and it's uttered basically in every neighborhood. And I wonder exactly what it looks like now in Bensonhurst and what we think it might look like. Referring again to my stats from the Furman Center, the median sales price for units in a 1 to 4 unit building is higher in Sunset Park than anywhere else in the city. And Bensonhurst is ranked number 4 of the 59 community districts. So we're talking about areas where there is, in fact, very valuable, incredibly valuable real estate. Ms. Kitman or Mr. Kwong or Mr. Mak, what does that look like in Bensonhurst? Is that about a different ethnic group coming in, or is that about Chinese of higher means pushing those of lower means out? What is the specific context of gentrification in that area? Whoever wants to jump in.
Well, gentrification is a fighting word, but the issue here is that Chinese population coming in very large number generally increase the real estate value. So this is the case with Manhattan, Chinatown. This is the case with Sunset Park, and this clearly is the case with Bensonhurst as well. But I think there's certain differences. There are neighborhoods, particularly in Manhattan and also in Sunset Park, you have very large developers coming in with capital, building high-rises. And that is a much more stronger push for gentrification. So when you have that, you are really changing the neighborhood in a very, very significant way. So this is what Manhattan, Chinatown is fighting against. Bensonhurst is a little bit different. Bensonhurst is basically people, Chinese population. By the way, I would say the people who move in Bensonhurst are better off people in terms of financially. People who had some saving and work and able to say, hey, you know, I want a better place to live, I want a residential area, and there's more space, etc., etc. So Chinese tend to prefer single houses, right? So now, so in that sense, they are displacing the original residents. In many cases, Italians, some other neighborhoods, but generally a lot of the Italians. In this sense, then, you have a kind of a changeover. Now, a lot of Italians' family are actually moving. They are already in the slow process moving to other parts. Long Island, New Jersey, etc., etc. So in this sense, then, the Chinese coming in is not really a kind of a disturbing aspect.
Right, it's not displacement,
No.
it's a standard ethnic succession
Right.
process.
At the same time, as I mentioned before, I do not know many very large developers wants to, at this time, with Chinese money, wanting to invest in Benson. There may be in the future, but certainly that's the case with. So I don't know. I mean, it just seems that so far the transition displacement has never been a very large tension. Now there are tension to the extent that the neighbor who remained next door to new immigrants, there are cultural issues, there are aesthetic issues, there are issues about, you know, different kind of habits. So that's the kind of thing I hear. So in a sense, I wouldn't say gentrification is a real serious issue. Displacement, it's not there is displacement, but it's not a very high level hostile one.
I just want
Somebody be impolite, please.
I just want to quickly add that I think people are looking at buying real estate as a financial option, as in many different neighborhoods. So what is happening is that people are willing to pay a higher price in order to obtain a house, and what they would do is that they would try to convert it into single-room occupancy, and as a result, the benefits that they're able to generate would be much higher than usual. And I think that has been a driving force both in Sunset Park as well as in the Bensonhurst. So not every house is being converted into a single-room occupancy, but I think the major force for pushing up the prices are the fact that you are able to actually make money out of the transition because of the conversion.
Yeah, I would just add it on. That happens in Bensonhurst, but I think Sunset Park and Flushing and Manhattan is a lot more. So in other words, a Chinese family buy a house, it's not just for themselves, but also try to split the building into rentals. Mm-hmm. That help to increase the number of people coming in. In comparison, degree-wise, I think Bensonhurst is a lot less. So there are people, but it's a lot less.
Ms. Kitman.
I think it's a change from land use, of the land use from private house to condominium, to residential units, to meet the demand of the population and also meet the demand for housings. Instead of having a private house, they build a 30 units residential, they can make more money. The developer actually can make more money. As you see that there's trend that now allow private house, they do demolition, they demolish the entire house to build residential units. That's how.
Is that a significant development in Bensonhurst?
I think yes, and also Queens, Flushing.
So, Councilman, in many areas in the city, the de Blasio administration has said that the answer to pressures like this is to do a rezoning, to upzone, to impose mandatory inclusionary housing, mandatory inclusionary zoning, I should say. Do you foresee city planning taking a look at Bensonhurst? Do you think that should happen?
What a timely conversation. Those are the conversations we're having right now. The one thing I would just say, and I've said this to the administration, I've said this to my colleagues in the council, is that there really is no one-size-fits-all approach in New York City. And I believe that many residents would agree with me on that. Each neighborhood is very unique. There are some common needs, but certainly each neighborhood is very unique. Good luck telling a Bensonhurst resident that a new development that could be 6 stories high doesn't have to provide parking. Good luck. I will not be at that meeting. And that is, those are the conversations that we're having, because I think that one of the terms that we haven't heard much of in recent years, which we heard a lot during the Bloomberg years, was a term called overdevelopment. There were some neighborhoods in Gravesend, which neighbors Bensonhurst, that wanted to rezone to downzone.
That's right.
Because there are historically low-rise homes. And then what we saw was in the middle of a block of 1 or 2 story homes, they would knock down a home and put a 6-story condo, like a sore thumb, and really destroy the character of that neighborhood. So people really fought hard to try to rezone, to try to preserve a neighborhood's character. Being mindful that the housing stock is in demand. That is very true. And so you have to balance the needs of our city, of our neighborhoods, about trying to preserve the character to the best of our ability. But I would just say that there is no one-size-fits-all approach. I cannot accept the notion that parking is not a problem. It is. And as much as we might want to say that, well, people should just have bikes. Not everybody honestly, not everybody in my neighborhood has a bike nor says they want to have a bike. I bikes are good, but we have many drivers, and parking spots are a big issue in our neighborhood. Coney Island too, by the way, and other parts of the city. So we need to be mindful of making sure that these zoning policies or zoning initiatives are taking into account some very serious, real neighborhood concerns. And I would argue that many of the Asian American community residents would agree with me about the parking issue.
Land use and politics go hand in hand in New York City,
Oh, yeah.
and the political power or development of the Asian community has long been a subject of rumination, whether it would eventually achieve size proportion to its population, how it would. Right now, New York has one Asian American congresswoman. It has two city council members from that group, and one assembly person, no one in the state senate. Councilman, since you are an elected official, I ask you, do you feel as though the political power of Brooklyn's Chinese community is commensurate to its role in the population, and if not, why not?
So this is also a very timely conversation, because these are conversations happening in political circles as we speak. Just to give you context, I happen to be the first Russian-speaking New York City council member in its history. And we just actually, in recent years, just elected the first Asian American public official district leader. It's a party official title named Nancy Tung in District 47, which is the Assembly District, which covers Bensonhurst and Gravesend. And there were some conversations about that because the neighborhood has evolved, the neighborhood has changed, and I do believe that we need to work making sure that our elected leaders do reflect the evolution and changes of our neighborhoods. We just actually have elected the first Asian American district manager of Community Board 13, which covers Coney Island, parts of Bensonhurst, Gravesend, and parts of Brighton Beach as well, Eddie Mark. I'm very proud of him as well. And there is no doubt that there has been a history of gerrymandering throughout, not just in New York, but across the country. But gerrymandering to really try to protect certain interests and to try to, and it hurts by consequence other interests. But as I mentioned before, I represent parts of Bensonhurst. Historically, Bensonhurst, you know, maybe back in the day, and Senator Marty Solomon's here, he used to represent parts of Bensonhurst as well. Back in the day, it might have been more together, but now it is chopped up. So I have a piece of Bensonhurst, but I don't have all of Bensonhurst. And I don't think that these things were done by accident. So I do believe that we need to be very mindful that when they redraw these districts, they need to be mindful to protect these groups and making sure that we're not diluting their power, but actually empowering them. So I believe the time has come for Brooklyn and for other parts of the city to advance and push and support elected officials that are representative of their neighborhoods.
Yeah, I think this issue is much more complicated. It's not automatically that the political power is in proportion to the population. This is the case that I've been in Lower Manhattan for many, many years. In the 70s, we fight for tribal representation. It only took until late 90s, we have John Liu become the first person to get elected in the city council. Now, so there are many issues involved in the ability of particular new immigrant group able to fully participate. The first one, as far as Chinese community over the years, is the voting population and their actual populations oftentimes very far apart. So, for instance, Bensonhurst, you have about 35% of Chinese. We're talking about maybe 30,000 Chinese, but only 10% insofar as the votes come out when it's voting. So when you have only 10% people voting, even though you have 30% population, politicians are not under pressure to do anything, right? So this is, I'm not trying to accuse you, but I'm saying clearly there's an issue.
There is.
Secondly, there's the issue about the activism of the population. a lot of Chinese population, immigrants not familiar with political environment, political skills, very busy, not often very involved, right? And then there is the issue. When you get into politics, the transition from generation to generation, from one ethnic group to the next, you knew in order to get into a political process, you need the support of the party structures. So in other words, the Democratic Party would have to somehow nurture, educate the new immigrant group coming into political process. Now that is lacking as well, since again, go back to the question, well, what is it that, I would say that it would take a significant readjustment, significant effort from the Chinese community itself to try to get the voting population up, get the activism up, and that would also mean the social organizations, political organizations need to be oriented much more to the American political process than a lot of times a lot of issues that they're affecting to.
If I may give you, when I was in my activist, still activist now, but when I was right before teaching and worked part-time for an elected official, some member of Bill Colton, when I was still going to school, one of the first issues I got involved in was what was happening at Lafayette High School. And this is something that you can Google and research, because this was a pretty covered news event. And I was very much involved in this day to day. To summarize, there were a number of students from that school that were being beaten up and got pretty bad. And we found a pattern that many of their cases just ended up not being followed up and went nowhere. And there were no discipline against those people who were responsible. When we finally, got connected with the principal, that former principal, should I say, there was an attitude where if a student does not speak English, it's really not his problem. That's what he claimed. And that became our problem. And we organized. And it was not just Asian American kids that were getting beaten up. There were Russian speaking, Spanish speaking, African American, you name it. And what we realized then is that we really needed to mobilize the diverse immigrant communities of Bensonhurst to demand safety improvements for this school. And new organizations and a new mindset kind of evolved. I think that when immigrants first come to this country, their immediate goal is to just get adjusted, get settled in, make sure the bills are paid, making sure you have a roof over your head, you're feeding your family, kids are going to school. But now the next chapter is how do I get better engaged in the community? How do I make a difference? How do I get active? And this event, which happened in 2003, 2004, this became the evolution that I personally witnessed and seen because new organizations evolved. People who were involved in that Lafayette High School issue, mind you, the principal is now no longer principal of that school. So that was a good result. But the United States Justice Department got involved and entered into a consent decree with the DOE saying that you must provide immigrant services, translation services in different languages when an incident occurs against a student, because the school felt that if they didn't speak English, it wasn't their problem. It was terrible. And so I witnessed firsthand how that created a mechanism for further activism. And some of the people who I mentioned before who are now leaders, they were born out of that fight. And I believe that, from my perspective, I worked for an assemblyman who took over an office. His predecessor was named Frank Barbaro. That name goes back to Bensonhurst's time. Frank Barbaro would not even allow a Russian staff person to be seen in his district office. He would hide them upstairs because he didn't want to upset the nativists. And when Assemblyman Bill Colton took over that office, the first thing he did was that he took the people that Frank Barbaro hid and brought them down to the main desk and said, you are this community and you'll be here front and center. So you need elected officials, as you pointed out, that are very inclusive, that are not afraid of change, but embrace it and cultivate it. And I know that a part of our job is to pass the torch on, not to hold it forever.
And of course, when we talk about
Yes.
communities, any of these communities, Latino communities in New York, that embraces everybody from Puerto Ricans to Cubans, who obviously come from very different backgrounds. And Professor Kwong referred to, obviously, some of the language differences within the Chinese community. Mr. Mak or Ms. Kitman, I'd like to hear, to those of us who are uninitiated, have any of the displacement forces or demographic changes in New York brought different Chinese language communities together? And do any tensions result from that? Can they communicate with each other? Is that oil and water, or do they mix well? What is it like when Cantonese and Mandarin speakers suddenly become neighbors in New York City?
Can I just go back a little? I think in order for the Asian to be elected within the borough of Brooklyn, I think we need to do a lot more community education as well as voter registration. But the most important thing is the redistricting of the boundary of each one of the councilmember or whatever district, because I think at this moment, I think Asians are being divided into many different neighborhoods and different districts also. To go back to your question, I think at the beginning, when the Mandarin-speaking population started moving into the Brooklyn area, they were in very small number, so they had to learn Cantonese and they had to adopt the traditional way of Chinese living in Brooklyn. But however, as their number reaching higher and higher, basically, I think they are able to really maintain their own cultures and bringing in some of the way they handle their life from China back to from China to New York, and so therefore I think the Cantonese speaking population are beginning to learn Mandarin in order to really communicate with them, because I think at this moment they are outnumbered than the Cantonese speaking population.
Is that what you see as well?
I think Sunset Park, majority of the Sunset Park residents are primary speaking Mandarin, and then the Bensonhurst are primary speaking Cantonese. But Mandarin is the mother language. When they communicate with each other, they speak Mandarin. But if they don't, if the people does not speak Mandarin, why now they go to Mandarin school to learn Mandarin? And then the Mandarin student, they will go to Cantonese school to learn Cantonese. Yeah, that's the change.
I think the historical issue, we need to be clear that Cantonese was the original immigrants coming to United States, overwhelming Cantonese. In New York is concerned not just Cantonese, but one small county of Canton, Toisan. So the majority of the Cantonese in Chinatown actually come from Toisan, and which is a much more unfamiliar dialect. But this changed since 1960s when immigrants coming from Canton. So Cantonese have established itself as a dominant language until the Fujianese start coming in the 70s, 80s, mainly in the 80s. And today, of course, many more different kind of Chinese people from different parts of China come. Now, one thing I need to explain is that China was united in 1949. And so if you were born in 1949, your schooling is mainly Mandarin. So you may be Fujianese, but you had to learn Mandarin. Now, yes, if you're from Canton, if you're from Fujian, you're oftentimes much more comfortable, don't want it to, but in the main, Mandarin is increasingly a universal language in the Chinese community, unless you're older, unless you're 60s and 70s. Otherwise, it's really not that extreme of division.
So just a programming note, in about 5 minutes, we're going to open it up for questions from the group, so start thinking of your questions. We'll get to as many of them as we can. we talked just now about relations within the Chinese community. I want to get back to a theme that's come up a couple times, which is in Bensonhurst, how Chinese residents interact with their neighbors. Obviously, there are past stories of houses being targeted, other incidents. What is the climate like in terms of, I guess we'll start with you, Mr. Mak, of the, dealings with Italians and others who predate the Chinese or live among them?
Well, I think at the beginning of any neighbor development, there got to be problems and concerns by the old timers. But as the neighborhood become more and more of the Asian population, so I think especially with the second generation, so I think many of the Chinese population, they begin to understand the importance of interacting with their neighbors. So even though we are seeing old ladies and senior citizens who do not speak the language, but however, I think they understand the importance of outreaching, so they might just say hi to their non-Asian neighbors. So I think we are seeing a lot more improve as far as the interaction with the existing neighborhood residents, I guess.
Any other impressions on that?
I would just, this might go a little bit outside the border of Bensonhurst, but Gravesend. Detective Wen Jianwu, who was assassinated and killed. He lived in Gravesend, and speak to his neighbors and ask them how he was with them. They're also hurting. In addition, of course, to his great wife and his family, his parents. I try to tell people that if we focus on the commonalities and less on differences, you'll be amazed by how much we have in common. This was a person that would come home late from work, and in addition to making sure his dad ate, would check on his neighbor who's, they have neighbors who are Italian, neighbors who are from different parts of the world, making sure that they had, when he cooked something delicious, he would offer his neighbors food as well. So are there still some challenges? Yes, we actually, just a few months back, we had a situation where some merchants on Bay Parkway were being harassed by teenagers from middle school. And they were going into the businesses, knocking down products, yelling, screaming. And we actually had to organize them. We actually formed now a Bay Parkway Merchants Association. They're predominantly are Asian American businesses now, not all, but many of them. And we had to organize them, and we brought them down to the 62nd Police Precinct with translators to speak to the captain. And once we communicated what the issues and challenges were, within a week, the captain came down, sat in a chair, watched the school dismissal, and watched the kids again go in to bother the businesses. Went in, and he took care of things right away. But I would say for the most part, many common needs and many common, go to the same schools, eat at the same restaurants, walk down the same blocks, take the same buses. So I would say for the most part, I would say things are good, but we at times do see these types of actions that are divisive or target a certain community, and we in politics and we in the community have to speak out and organize immediately to denounce it. It's really, really important that we make sure that we are, I made this message in my district, that an attack against one person is an attack against all. So when there was a flyer against Muslim residents, we all came together and denounced it. But I would say for the most part, I would say I don't hear many types of issues or complaints, but when they do come up, and they do, we immediately organize, mobilize it to squash it, and to also learn and educate people about it.
So your turn. Anybody have a question about Chinese Bensonhurst, Asian Brooklyn? I'm told you have to speak into the mic because this is being recorded for posterity, or at least the next few weeks. So,
I represented Bensonhurst. I lived there until 2000. I was a state senator. That, in terms of the definition of Bensonhurst, it's always been a moving target. My district at that point in the Bensonhurst then went from 18th Avenue all the way past 26th Avenue. But I just want to tell you something. I also co-chaired the Senate Democratic Campaign Committee for a number of years. Your issue on voting is very interesting. I'll just throw a statistic at you. In 1964, the great majority of citizens in Kings County were Jewish. There's one Jewish congressman, the rest were Irish. And basically, you hit it on the head. The way ethnic groups vote is they come here first, they're worried about shelter and food. The seniors are the ones that vote no matter whatever you study across the board. There's a highest proportion of seniors vote in that ethnic group. So as the group ages and matures, by the second or third generation, they'll gain the votes. I first reached out to the Russian and Chinese community. I left office in '95. I had someone who spoke. I got Brighton Beach into part of my district in the '92 reapportionment. And I hired someone who spoke Russian. And I hired someone who spoke Chinese. We found approximately 1,000 registered Chinese voters. We sent a letter out to them in Chinese. We had very small reaction, though I had Chinese neighbors in the block I live. So I think your voting is just natural. If you look at the history of the city of New York and you trace voting patterns back, you will see immigrant groups don't vote initially. In fact, in 1970, Bensonhurst was 70% Jewish. 1980, it had been reduced to 30% Jewish, but in the Democratic primary, it was 70% Jewish vote.
Right.
And I think that's the best example. So, yes, you have to register people, but the fact of the matter is, I guarantee you that if you checked in Chinatown, the majority of voters of that ethnic group is senior citizens, and that's just naturally occurring. And there were problems when I was a state senator, but it were the Korean grocers that were the first ones that were attacked, and we had to deal with that as an issue. And it's just the same as any group in any place, because I can tell you now, it's in this library. I donated items we found when we reconstructed that Democratic Club, journals from the 20s and 30s and the histories of the clubs. Bensonhurst, when they formed the political club in the 20s, there were about 33 to 35 members of the board's directors. 3 Jews, 3 Italians, the rest were Irish. Now, when I got elected in '78, we had a few people that were Irish. So it's a gradual neighborhood, it changes, and Bensonhurst is not a neighborhood where you have generations that live. They become educated and they move out. The first wave of the Italian Americans, there were people like Frank Pino, one of the first Italian American judges here. There was a political fight in '59. But the kids move out, my neighbors. Then there was a second wave of Italian Americans that people are ignoring that came into Bensonhurst from Sicily when immigration opened up again after World War II, because Italians, Chinese, and Jews basically were excluded from America in 1917 and 1924.
So any reaction to that? I mean, I always thought the persistence of Irish power was because we're so charming, but apparently it's just that's a misconception.
I would just, point well taken. Thank you, Senator and Judge Solomon. Immigration waves, this is a part of the fabric of Bensonhurst. This is the latest chapter of our story, and we will continue to evolve. We're seeing a growing Hispanic community. We're seeing a growing community from Pakistan, where this is to me, the benefits is that you get a new great ethnic food store opening up. I enjoy cooking, so I like to go, try things out. So this is our story. We've been, for the most part, yes, there's been historically, there's been some challenges, but I believe that we have been New York City's barometer on immigration waves. But I would also argue that the pull factors to Bensonhurst remain constant. Train service, bus options, good schools, public safety. That has remained relatively strong, and that is what I think attracts immigrant families to come in as well. Because initially they they don't have a car right away, need to get to work. If you work in Manhattan or work different parts of the city, you need to find a way to commute. You also want to send your kids to good schools. So again, those pull factors have remained constant with all these changes throughout the decades.
I want to respond to the question you were asking about Irish. I think different ethnic groups historically do exhibit different kind of inclination to political participation. I mean, the Irish first came in the 19th century. They came and they used their population as a bloc and taking over political system. So by the time the end of the 19th century, Irish took over many city halls all across the East Coast. Whereas Jews tend to be a lot less concerned about political participation. You know, if you see the history, I guess what's his name? Abe Beame is the first Jewish mayor, right? So Chinese also has this. It's kind of a historical thing. Chinese are the largest overseas group in the world today, right? And they have Chinese all over Southeast Asia and places like that. The historical thing is Chinese tend not to be wanting to participate directly politically. They would want to influence insofar as financial contributions. So as a matter of fact, Chinese Americans' political contribution is quite significant. When you talk about Democratic Party, you know, Bill Clinton, Hillary, they all come to Chinatown to look for money. But the point is, so there's a different kind of participation pattern going on as well.
And if I could just quickly add one
Sure.
quick, because it's really important to mention this. Just because Bensonhurst might have seen the wave of Asian Americans, I would say in 1980s or so, I was always telling my students this when I was a teacher, and I feel it's worth repeating now. Doesn't mean that America first saw that wave. You know, let's be mindful that Asians helped build the Transcontinental Railroad. Let's be mindful that, you know, they were victims of the Exclusion Act that was passed by our Congress back then. So I even have to remind my colleagues in government today that this is not a new generation, it's not new. They've been here, it's just maybe new to the neighborhood at this particular time, but not new to the country. That's a very important
Very good point. Question over there on the aisle.
Thank you for your very interesting presentation. What would you say is the predominating reasons for Asian immigration to the United States and more specifically New York City?
Anyone?
Well, United States always has a very, very good, Chinese have very, very good impression of the United States. It's ironic because, you know, 19th century, all these European United States, all, you know, trying to be imperial power, but somehow United States always played a game of, well, we're the democratic country, and oftentimes play on the side of China against Britain. So Chinese always have this very positive idea about America. And of course, America is rich, and people talk about how, you know, I mean, Chinese came to the gold rush. The name of China, United States, Gold Mountain. So there's a mutual kind of a relationship. America had very good positive image in the Chinese mind. I mean, considering all the terrible things that happened, exclusion and all these things. But nevertheless, this is the thing. America is rich. People want to come to the United States, a country that has quote-unquote democracy. So that's one very, very important motivation. Insofar as New York's concerned, and that's a very important point, the reason New York City has more Chinese than San Francisco, right, is that New York has always been a place out of the whole United States has the largest labor market, right? So in other words, when you talk about you want to get a job, you don't have much education, very little immigrants find New York is the place most likely to do so. Over the century, New York's Chinatown, Chinese population, their education level, income level is much lower than the rest of the Chinese, the rest of the. In fact, if you look at the national census of Chinese education level income, right, very, very high. The Chinese is way above American whites in terms of education, in terms of income. But if you look at New York City's Chinese census, then it's not really that significant. It's almost the same as the average. So the point I'm trying to emphasize is New York represents the largest labor market, and a lot of working class people if they don't have relatives, they come to New York.
Ms. Kitman, you came relatively recently. What were your reasons for coming to New York?
I think the reason for people come to U.S. is like a gym that come to here for opportunity to better living conditions, living quality, and also a better educational and health systems that which is China cannot provide. That's why they come here for opportunities.
Other questions?
Can I also
I'm
just
sorry,
add
yes,
one
please.
thing? Actually, I think New York City is very friendly to immigrant population. Either you are documented or undocumented. For example, I think even though if you're undocumented, you are still able to secure many benefits for the family and their children, and that is one of the attractions that many people have been referring to.
In the front here.
So can anybody comment on the non-Chinese Asian groups that are in New York? And I assume the numbers are just very, very small compared to the Chinese, but do they also have similar challenges? Do they live in separate communities, or do they also join some of the Chinese communities?
Very good question. So good that our panel...
Well, I mean, I could tell you just like my district demographics. Like for example, I believe my district has about 26% what we call Asian Americans, but about, I think 20% are Chinese speaking. So I have a district of 168,000 people, about 35,000 or so say they speak Chinese, but that's not all Asian Americans. So it's a great question. I mean, you have people from different parts of the world. I mean, I have, there are pockets of Koreans, but again, it's not in the same type of numbers that we see in other parts of the city.
So the other groups are Koreans,
Yeah.
South Asians, and Bangladesh has the fastest growth rate to United States. And then we do have some Filipinos as well as Thais. So the South Asians are the fastest growing in terms of coming to New York.
So the questions are flying in. We're going to go to this woman in the front row, and then back there, and then to you, ma'am. So one, two, three. Oh, sorry, you wanted to chime in. This is an answer to that question, so we'll let her speak, and then...
I'm Korean American. I came to United States in 1960 to go to attend NYU. At that time, there were 100 Koreans in New York. The Koreans started to come here right after Korean military junta revolution. The major Korean business groups came in 1965, and now Korean immigrants created an interesting business. For example, nail salon is invented by a Korean woman. Green grocery, vegetable store, this is invented by Korean dry cleaners. And not many of my undergraduate classmates who were the artists, musicians, professors, they are running dry cleaning store, and their wives are running nail salon, all that. But none of their kids are doing that. Yes, the Korean second generation or 1.5 generation Korean young people have a choice, following choice to become a professional. Lawyers, doctors, accountant, God help us if you want to be an artist. So a lot of my colleagues from, I taught at NYU, now I'm running a private foundation. My colleagues, Jewish and Irish, Italian, always told me, you sure you're not Jewish? You sure not you are Italians? We have a very similar trends. And Koreans are also known as the Irish of the Orient because Korean people love to drink and we love to sing. Most popular music, my generation, is Oh Danny Boy.
Pipes are calling. All right.
Thank you. This is a two-part, but it's quick. What proportion of the Chinese immigrants become citizens, and what proportion of Southeast Asians become citizens?
Anybody know offhand?
So overwhelmingly becoming citizens. So one of the issues with the Chinese American you mentioned earlier, many of them came in as illegals, or coming legally and overstay. But most of these people eventually apply for political asylum, whatever, become legal. So overwhelming majority Chinese population are legal. And usually they will want to become citizens because that would be able afford them to get all the benefits and privileges of being a citizens.
I just want to say that I think before a lot of senior citizens did not want to become citizens by going through the educational or whatever testing. But however, when Congress, when they adopt the new law that you need to be an American citizen in order to obtain some of the SSI and all those benefits, I think people will suffer at one point. But however, I think it provided a motivation for them to become American citizens.
And to the credit of Mr. Mak's organization, he does a lot of service around this area of adult literacy and classes and programming to help people prepare for these types of exams, and that's the credit of BCA as well.
I think the 1997 Immigration Act was the act that you're talking about that mainly made it, if you don't have citizenship, you're not going to be able to
Right.
yeah.
A question in the back over here, and then we'll go here for one last. Maybe
This
more.
is a question for Professor Kwong. I think you said that in Bensonhurst you see a lot of second and third generation Chinese, correct?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
So I wondered, where did they grow up?
Okay.
And when they are ready to move out of Bensonhurst, where do they go?
Yeah. Okay. This is an issue that Paul tried to answer earlier. And that is to say that people move to Bensonhurst. There are two routes. The first route tend to be kids growing up in Chinatown, and they have a professional job, just like you're saying. Chinese too. Parents don't want their kids to be, doing the kind of labor-intensive manual work. So they get a good job. They decided Chinatown is not where they want to be living. Buy a house in Bensonhurst, move the parents there, right? And the parents, then they have kids, and the grandparents will be taking care of the kids. So that's the kind of arrangement. The first route is coming from Manhattan, Chinatown. The other one is people who move in Sunset Park first, and they do better, and maybe they speak Cantonese. They feel not very comfortable because Fujianese is coming in very large number, and they are wealthy enough, comparatively, then they move to Bensonhurst. So this is what I'm talking about, 3 generations. And so many of the main family owner is not the first generation, it's rather the second generation.
And so where do they go from, if they leave Bensonhurst, where do they go?
Well, Long Island. I think this is where I think that, you see, this is something people don't quite understand. Chinese population is bipolar. You have a working class population coming from the semi-rural areas of South. Then you have a very, very educated professional class, all right? This is what I call the uptown Chinese. They are from, they come here for graduate school, right? After they graduate school, they go right into an upper middle class job, a job, and move into upper neighborhood, suburban living. So the majority of Chinese population actually are suburbanites, if you believe it, which all the Asian groups are like that. So if you get tired of Bensonhurst, you're going to live in the suburbs.
And I think this probably have to be the last question over here.
Of course, if you get tired of suburbs, you move to Manhattan.
Hi. Okay. I hope I'm not ending this discussion on a dour note, in that I sort of want to play the devil's advocate. I live in what is becoming rapidly a Chinese neighborhood, that's Steiger Heights. And I'm living there 3 years. I lived previously in Park Slope, which I miss dearly, but I was priced out. but I feel very much out of place in Dyker Heights. And the people who live in my neighborhood are real Chinese immigrants. These are not Chinese Americans. You'll almost never hear them speaking English or reading an English newspaper. And they come with third world habits, like coughing and not covering their mouth in the subway, riding their motorbikes on the sidewalk. If one talks about everything in moderation, well, the explosion of the Chinese population to New York and to Brooklyn is not moderation. And if things continue unrestricted, unfettered, as they have for the last 10 or 15 years, what will New York look like in 20 or 30 years?
Any reaction?
Yes, I mentioned this earlier, all right? I mentioned that the displacement seemed not to necessarily be a problem, but the neighbors that's left often have problems, cultural habits and all that kind of stuff. And so that's something quite different. I mean, you know, I don't know what's your origins anyway. Your family's... yes. And you know, your groups, when they first came to the United States, people looked down on you too. And so you know, I mean, you eat cabbage, you do all those things. So these are cultural class differences that is somehow you can't avoid. You come here, like everybody else, have the right to come to the United States, right? You bring whatever, you know, background you come, okay? Clearly you're different, and other people don't like it. So the new Chinese immigrants, some of them do have these kind of issues, but it's not going to be forever. Just like you're not. Okay, generations later, people learn, people try to modify. This is not something that nobody wants to be a pain in the ass to a community they move into. They eventually modify. So I wouldn't be very upset about this because...
And I'll also add that many of the, I would say, by now, Jewish and Italian grandma and grandpas who owned homes in Bensonhurst in the 60s, 70s, and 80s, I don't think they complained too much when they bought their home maybe for $100,000 and sold their home for over $500,000 to a new Asian American family. So there is no question, I think, that has been a historical issue with regards to any group. I mean, talk about the clash between the Italians and the Irish. We can spend a whole series on that here, too. There was a challenge for the Russian-speaking community when they came here. And I still get annoyed to this day when people say, oh, you're Russian. No, my family's from Ukraine. 15 different nations made up that Soviet Union. So I would just argue there's a net plus. There's a significant net plus to us being so open and inclusive. There's always going to be cultural shifts and getting used to different things. But at the end of the day, when I look at our commercial corridors, I'll give you one example, in Bensonhurst, and compare it to other parts of my district where I don't have a bakery in parts of Coney Island, boy, would I take Bensonhurst, right? I mean, Bensonhurst, every single block, you have life, you have activity, you have commerce, you have things going on. Yes, you have people that need to make sure that they, follow the rules, but there is a significant net side. And I just think that we need to be mindful of history and be mindful of being inclusive and embracing the changes in our society.
I have a question for Mr. Mak, actually. How strong are the connections between the Chinese community here and events back in China? Have you seen, among the population you work with, effects from the recent economic turmoil in China, the currency problems? Does that wash up here? Do we see an echo?
Well, I guess for the most part, I think people are happy that they are out from mainland China. I think the only connection that they have is that being that we have one of the highest birth rate within the city of New York. So with with the lacking of daycare and school facilities. So basically, I think the majority of the Chinese parents are sending their children back to China, and for their grandparents to take care and have them to come back when the children are ready for school. So basically, I think not much of a turmoil, but more of sending their children back and hoping that one day they would come back and that. I also want to say that I think for the gentleman, I think your point is well taken. We understand that some of the community or some of the residents are overwhelmed by some of the situation that is being seen in different neighborhoods. What can I say, including the Chinese American also.
So let's end on a future-looking note. Thinking about Bensonhurst 20, 30, 50 years in the future, I want everyone kind of a lightning round. Give me a fear you have and a hope you have for Bensonhurst. Let's start with the councilman.
Fear and a hope.
It could be the same thing if you want to be philosophical.
I would just say that as long as our community remains a safe, strong neighborhood, as long as we maintain and build our train service and our bus service, as long as we still have great public schools, I believe that we will continue to be a welcoming place for the next immigrant wave. So our story is not finished. We're still a long way to go. I would say that there are economic impacts because of our strong social features, and that it becomes an issue of people feeling they can't afford to live there. And so when I hear people say displacement, the issue is that when families, raise their children there and they get to college and they graduate from school, the issue becomes a one-bedroom condo could be up to $500,000. So my fear is just that I want us to be a neighborhood that raises our children and preserves our kids, and they could afford to live and really pass on the torch to their families. So I believe that we will remain a very strong neighborhood. We'll always be the city's barometer of our immigration waves, but I want to make sure that we remain an affordable place for our families today.
Ms. Kitman.
I hope Bensonhurst will remain safe, affordable, and also a better living neighborhoods. So hoping there will be more library that built into the community also, as well as landmarks.
Professor.
Yeah, my hope is not just Bensonhurst. I hope that United States continue to be a place that will be able to give opportunity to people coming in. But I also hope United States will be will be significant political economic reform that would be able to be productive country, a democratic country, a country that's really could offer, quote unquote, the dreams everybody wants to realize. My fear is, I think some of the political discussions today in the United States, they are quite alarming. We used to think that Europeans are kind of stuck up. They don't know how to deal with immigrants. Now, with some of the speeches from the Republicans, that's very worrying, and I hope that's something that would not happen.
Mr. Mak.
Well, I'm afraid the influx of the population that are moving into the Bensonhurst area, I'm very afraid the affordability, because I think allowing immigrant population to really afford their either housing or storefront where they are able to get into the business is very important. So I'm just hoping that it is not going to follow the footstep of Sunset Park or Borough Park, where a single house family will be selling for $2 million or more on the side street, and that could be problematic for the whole neighborhood as well as the borough of Brooklyn.
Well, let me say, as I do at the close of each of these events that I have the pleasure to host, and thanks to the Society for letting me do so, anywhere else in the country, this conversation would all be taking place in the abstract. Here, you can jump on a subway and see it up close. So I encourage folks who haven't recently or don't do it often to visit Bensonhurst, eat there, hang out there, talk to people. It's a beautiful thing. And certainly, for now anyway, please join me in thanking this incredible panel. And please have a good night. Thank you so much for coming.